Hey folks, this is Pat Quinn with the JoBlo Movie Network, welcoming film fans worldwide for another round of Show Me the Sequel. As always, we're focusing on a genre film that never got the follow-up it perhaps deserved. I'll start with a quick recap, share some behind-the-scenes stories, and then pitch my concept for a sequel. If you're a fan of horror movies, then you're a fan of John Carpenter. For the bulk of his career, he has stayed true to the genre. Like fellow directors George Romero, David Cronenberg, Wes Craven, and Dario Argento, John Carpenter seems to really enjoy making horror movies. Much has been written about his classic films like Halloween and The Thing. But today, we're taking a closer look at one of my favorite John Carpenter films, the original 1980 version of The Fog. The film takes place in Antonio Bay, a small town on the coast of Northern California. It's the night before the town's big centennial celebration. A group of children are sitting around a bonfire as a grizzled old fisherman, played by John Houseman, tells them a ghost story. It's 5 minutes till midnight. 100 years ago, the sailing ship Elizabeth Dane, led by William Blake, arrived in hopes of starting a leper colony. The ship got lost in the fog and mistook a bonfire for a signal fire. Treacherous rocks sank the ship, and the entire crew drowned. Legend has it that when the fog returns to Antonio Bay, the crew of the Elizabeth Dane will return seeking revenge. At the stroke of midnight, Father Malone, played by Hal Holbrook, discovers a diary and a cross made of solid gold hidden within the walls of Antonio Bay's historic church. The diary tells how Malone's grandfather, along with the town's founders, lit the bonfire as a beacon to lure the Elizabeth Dane into the rocks. The town was able to make its start with the gold they salvaged from the ship's wreckage. That same night, 3 local fishermen are out in their boat drinking. The boat gets enveloped in a thick fog, and a ghostly sailing ship pulls up alongside. It's the Elizabeth Dane. The ghosts of William Blake and his crew come aboard and kill the 3 fishermen. At the same time, Nick Castle, played by Tom Atkins, picks up a hitchhiker on a backcountry road. Elizabeth, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, is on her way to Vancouver. Suddenly, the truck's power goes dead and the windows are blown out. Similar phenomena is happening all over town. Lights flicker, windows burst, a gas station comes to life on its very own. Nick takes Elizabeth back to his place for safety. And because it's 1980, they soon end up in the sack. The fog rolls in, and there's a loud tap on the door. Nick opens it, but the clock strikes 1, the witching hour is over, and the fog rolls back out into the bay. The next day, Kathy Williams, played by Janet Leigh, is rushing around town preparing for the evening's celebration. She and her assistant Sandy, played by Nancy Loomis, visit Father Malone, who shares the contents of the diary and insists the centennial is cursed. Meanwhile, Nick and Elizabeth go looking for the missing fishermen. They find the boat as well as the 3 bodies, which are bloated with salt water, as if the men had drowned. The coroner brings the bodies in for an autopsy. One of the bodies comes to life and is about to attack Elizabeth. She screams and it falls dead to the floor. Nick takes her back to town to find the sheriff, who's at the centennial celebration. By late afternoon, the fog has started to roll in. Adrienne Barbeau plays Stevie Wayne, a DJ at KAB Radio. Leaving her son Andy in the care of a babysitter, she drives up to the lighthouse that she broadcasts from. From there, she can see the mysterious glowing fog as it approaches the town. The local weatherman calls with an update, but as they're talking, someone knocks on his door. The fog pours in, and a spectral figure impales him with a fishing hook. Stevie asks her radio listeners if someone can go check on the weatherman. Nick and Elizabeth hear her and head for the weather station. When they get there, the fog surrounds Nick's truck, and they barely get away from the creepy but slow-moving ghostly figures. Up at the lighthouse, Stevie can see the fog near her beach house and goes on the air to warn her son Andy. Blake and the others kill the babysitter, but Nick and Elizabeth get there in time to save Andy. As all this is happening, the town's centennial celebration is cut short when the power goes out. Kathy and Sandy head home and hear Stevie's warnings about the fog on the radio. They head up to the old church to avoid the fog, as does Nick and Elizabeth. They, along with Andy and Father Malone, barricade themselves in the church as the fog rolls in and Blake and his crew attack. Meanwhile, the fog has reached the lighthouse. Stevie scrambles up to the roof as the ghosts follow, their fishing hooks only inches away from her. Back at the church, Father Malone gives the gold cross to the ghost of William Blake just as the clock chimes 1. The ghosts disappear and the fog rolls back to the sea. Later that night, Father Malone wonders why his life was spared, since it was his grandfather that planned the conspiracy. Then he turns and sees Blake's ghost standing in the fog, cutlass raised, ready for the death blow. Father Malone is the final victim, and now the spirits can return to wherever they came from. John Carpenter is one of many famous filmmakers who graduated from the USC cinema program. In fact, while still a student, he co-wrote, edited, and composed the soundtrack to The Resurrection of Bronco Billy, which won the 1970 Academy Award for Best Live-Action Short Film. In 1974, he directed and co-wrote along with Dan O'Bannon the low-budget sci-fi comedy Dark Star. O'Bannon would go on to write the script for the original Alien, using a lot of the same ideas, though in a much darker context. Carpenter teamed up with producer Deborah Hill on the 1976 exploitation film Assault on Precinct 13. Then in 1978, he wrote and directed the TV movie Someone's Watching Me, as well as co-writing the thriller Eyes of Laura Mars, and most importantly, made one of the most influential and profitable horror movies of all time, Halloween. After that film's success, John Carpenter decided to follow it up with what he called an old-fashioned ghost story. Carpenter co-wrote the script with Deborah Hill after a visit to the ruins of Stonehenge, while they were in London promoting Assault on Precinct 13. They were also influenced by the films produced by Val Lewton, such as Isle of the Dead and I Walked with a Zombie. Another inspiration was the British horror film The Crawling Eye, which featured monsters in the clouds who decapitated their victims, though as you can see, the monsters in the cloud didn't look much like ghostly pirates. The Fog was part of a two-picture deal with Avco Embassy along with 1981's Escape from New York. The original budget was $1 million, and filming took place at various coastal towns in California, including Bodego Bay, where Alfred Hitchcock shot The Birds. Rick Baker protege Rob Bottin was hired to create the makeup effects as well as play the ghost of William Blake. 2 years later, Rob Bottin would create the groundbreaking makeup effects for John Carpenter's version of The Thing. One of the more interesting aspects of the film was the casting. John Carpenter likes to work with the same people behind and in front of the camera. Jamie Lee Curtis previously starred in Halloween, as did Nancy Loomis, who also appeared in Assault on Precinct 13. Both Adrienne Barbeau and Tom Atkins were in Escape from New York along with Kurt Russell, who has appeared in 5 John Carpenter films. One other bit of casting trivia, the role of Father Malone was originally offered to Christopher Lee, who wasn't available. Before that, Carpenter had tried to get him to play Dr. Loomis in Halloween. Christopher Lee passed on the part, which then went to Donald Pleasance. After screening a rough cut, Carpenter was unhappy with the results. It was slow, confusing, and not particularly scary. There was also pressure to increase the amount of gore. David Cronenberg's film Scanners had just come out, and the scene where a scanner's head explodes was the talk of the town. They ended up reshooting almost a third of the film. Added scenes included the prologue with John Houseman, the attack on the 3 fishermen, the scene in the morgue with the reanimated corpse, and the finale with Adrienne Barbeau being pursued up to the roof of the lighthouse. Released in February 1980, The Fog was a big hit at the box office, though it only got mixed reviews. But now it is generally considered to be one of the director's best films. In 1993, John Carpenter directed one of 3 segments for a made-for-television horror anthology called Body Bags. Inspired by its success, he and Deborah Hill considered producing their own horror anthology series based on The Fog, the concept being that in each episode, the appearance of the spectral fog would be part of the story. But the show never materialized, and instead John Carpenter and Deborah Hill co-produced the 2005 remake. Directed by Rupert Wainwright, who had previously made the 1999 horror film Stigmata, the remake was, while relatively faithful to the original script, a failure with critics and audiences alike. Since then, unlike the Halloween franchise, the studios haven't shown any interest in a sequel to The Fog. Neither is John Carpenter, who these days focuses more on his music than filmmaking. But personally, I'd love to see one, if only because I also love good old-fashioned ghost stories. That being said, Here's my pitch for a sequel. Fade in on a cabin cruiser anchored off the coast of Northern California. Jesse and Frank are scuba diving 40 feet below. Listening to their radio communication, we learn that they're looking for a shipwreck. The visibility is bad, but they can see a large shark swim past. They head into the kelp bed for safety. The shark follows them, and they go deeper. They enter a clearing in the kelp and see the wreck of a centuries-old sailing ship, but it's not the vessel they're looking for. The ship's name is still legible on the bow, the Elizabeth Dane. They explore the wreck, and Frank finds a skeleton clutching a small sea chest. Before they head up, he pries it loose with his knife. Jesse and Frank are amateur marine archaeologists who've been searching for the wreck of a Japanese submarine that was sunk in 1941. But now they're excited by this new wreck. They go online and see that the Elizabeth Dane was reported to have sunk in 1880 near a town called Antonio Bay. Jesse is upset that Frank broke maritime law by taking the chest, but is still excited to open it. The chest is filled with gold coins along with a journal kept by William Blake. It tells his side of what happened when he made a deal with the leaders of Antonio Bay to start a leper colony. Blake also talks about how much he misses his wife. They find a locket on a chain hidden between two pages. It has a tiny photo of a woman inside, a woman they assume was Blake's wife. Written in the locket are two words, "for eternity." Curious, Jesse and Frank decide to head for shore and Antonio Bay. The town has prospered since 1980 and is now a tourist destination. They go to the local pub, and Frank hits it off with one of the waitresses. They make a date to meet up when she gets off duty. Frank begs Jesse to let him have the boat for the night. Jesse agrees and goes back to the boat to get some overnight things. On a whim, he grabs Blake's journal so he can keep reading it. As Jesse wanders around town looking for a hotel, he's distracted by something in the window of an art gallery. It's a painting of the Elizabeth Dane. He asks the woman inside if she's the artist. She says yes, and that this is her gallery. The artist is Elizabeth Soley, again played by Jamie Lee Curtis. They talk for a while, and he asks her out to dinner. Despite her misgivings, she agrees. Over drinks, she tells him about meeting Nick Castle while hitchhiking through town back in 1980. They got married and settled here, but he had a heart attack 10 years ago. Now she makes a living selling her artwork to tourists. She paints the Elizabeth Dane because it often appears in her dreams. Jesse tells her about finding the wreck and shows her Blake's log and the woman's photo in the locket. Elizabeth is freaked out and brings him to her studio to see something. Along with more paintings of the Elizabeth Dane, there are a dozen portraits of the same woman in the locket who also appears in her dreams, Blake's wife. Elizabeth tells him what happened the night of the town's centennial and about the death of Father Malone. She's worried that Blake has come back and asks Jesse to stay with her for the night. Meanwhile, Frank and the waitress are back at the boat, which is tied up at the far end of the dock. They've fallen asleep after fooling around in the cabin. It's midnight and a thick fog bank sweeps in. There's a strange sound and Frank gets up to look around. He sees a pair of red eyes in the fog and is killed by a cutlass. Then the waitress is woken up by a knock on the cabin door. Fog pours in as it opens and she sees Blake's glowing eyes. The next day, Jesse and Elizabeth find the boat deserted, and the chest of gold is gone. At first, Jesse assumes that Frank has stolen the gold, but then they find strands of sea kelp littered around the cabin. Elizabeth takes him to a local maritime museum at the end of the pier. It's closed, but she knows the security guard who gives him a few minutes to look at the exhibit devoted to the Elizabeth Dane. Included in the exhibit is a large photograph of the woman that's in the locket. But in this photograph, she's older and deformed by leprosy. The text on the photo confirms that it's William Blake's wife. They leave, and the guard begins his rounds. He doesn't notice the thick bank of fog creeping over the pier. There's a knock on the door. He answers it, and a ghostly figure impales him with a fishhook. Then Blake shatters the display case and takes the photograph of his wife. Jesse and Elizabeth go back to her studio, and Jesse notices that in all of Elizabeth's portraits of Blake's wife, she's wearing the same locket and chain around her neck. Then they see the fog rising up around her studio. They barricade themselves in as fishhooks begin smashing the windows. Just at the last second, the town's clock chimes 1 o'clock and the fog fades away. They realize that Blake wants the locket. And more to the point, he wants it back with his wife. The log has coordinates to reach Tangier Island, where Blake and his crew originally sailed from. It's only a few hours from where he and Frank spotted the wreck in the kelp. The next day, Jesse and Elizabeth head out in the boat. As they get close, the clouds darken even though the weather report said clear skies. They reach the island, and Jesse sees an inlet where they can pull in. To his surprise, there's a roughly built dock. They head ashore and discover the crumbling buildings from the original leper colony. Then the fog rolls in, and dark figures emerge from the shadows. It's the ghosts of the long-dead lepers. Jesse and Elizabeth make a run for it, but are trapped in one of the cabins. Elizabeth sees one of the lepers wearing a rotting dress, the same dress Blake's wife is wearing in her paintings. It must be her. Blake and his men are also there, but Elizabeth manages to slip the locket around the neck of Blake's wife. Her shriveled hand reaches up and clasps the locket. There's a flash of light as she and Blake embrace for eternity. Jesse and Elizabeth run back to the boat, and as they sail away, the fog overwhelms the island, then fades away, leaving nothing but open ocean. There you go. That's my pitch for a sequel to The Fog. I hope you liked it, and thanks for watching the show. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our JoBlo Horror Videos channel. Tell your friends who dig this sort of content, and turn on the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. We are an independent company, and we appreciate all of your support.